So you must have found right through school and university that cultural, racial backgrounds, so forth, differences didn't mean much. Would that be right?
That would be very accurate. It's something that I'm really grateful for the way that I've grown up. I understand I've had an atypical background, but what's interesting with the way people grow up is your upbringing is just your upbringing. As a child especially, you don't really think of it as being particularly different or strange or anything like that. And of course, being somewhere like Saudi Arabia, in an expat community, most of my friends I had growing up also were living the same life I was, and their parents were doing something similar and so on. And then I had the opportunity, of course, to go to boarding school and then university. So growing up, I had heavy influence from 4 different countries' cultures in particular. So of course, Saudi Arabia, the UK, which is where I'm originally from, and I'd go visit and I went to school, and then Nigeria, of course, and then the USA, because I was in an American school and I was surrounded by Americans all the time. So I was able to unknowingly, I guess, instill ideas and perspectives from these different cultures, let alone the different countries I've traveled to during then and since then, into the way I view and think about the world and about the human condition. And I think in everything I do, from my music to my podcasting to social media, public speaking, I'm able to draw on quite a range of different experiences and perspectives. Now, when I was in school, it was a very diverse community in the truest sense of the word. The truest sense of the word. Of course, Saudi Arabia is a predominantly very, very heavily Muslim Islamic country. In the expat community, you had Muslims, Christians, atheists, Hindus, people of all different religious backgrounds, all different nationalities. If you look at a picture of my preschool class or my kindergarten class, it was just, it looked like a little UN or something like that. So from day one, I've always just been surrounded by all different sorts of people. And the idea that someone's skin color or ethnic background or nationality or anything like that should or is some big deal that I'm supposed to focus on or think about, none of that ever even came to my mind, which is one of the strange things that's sort of happened. If you see a lot of the things that have been happening with the identity politics that's playing in the West right now over the past decade, it's quite curious to me, because I'm like, that's very far removed from how I was raised and how I grew up and my own worldview and experiences. That's just not the framework that I view the world in. But it was a very blessed upbringing. I'm very glad that I was able to have it in that way. And I'm glad that people are interested in hearing my perspective and that I'm able to reach such a broad range of people. I mean, I'll be honest with you right now, the fact that I'm sitting here in Sydney, Australia, chatting with you is like, wow, like this is...
Don't get too personal. I know I'm an old guy.
No, but it's amazing to me. I mean, I'm from 10,000 miles away.
Yeah.
And everything I've done independently. I'm not someone who ever signed to a big label or company or had millions of dollars or pounds put into me to promote me out to the world or anything. It's been very, very organic. So when I'm traveling around Australia now or the USA or all these different countries, and the fact that there are people who know and care about what I do to any degree, let alone a large degree, is pretty amazing to me. And I'm always excited about my life, and I'm just like, man, I can't wait to see how this all plays out, because it's just an ongoing adventure.
Well, that's tremendous. Let me ask this question.
Sure.
In those school and university environments and all those places you've been in, you've talked about diversity in a way that I think is really important, because in Australia, when we hear all the language about inclusion and equity and diversity usually ends up meaning, well, we'll have somebody with that color of skin, someone of that gender, we'll have someone of whatever, physical characteristics.
Yes.
But you dare not deviate from the line in terms of beliefs or thinking.
Yes.
You're really nailing the reality that you've been able to mix across people of genuine diversity in terms of what they believe, where they're coming from, their worldviews, the lot. That seems to me to be something we're really missing. In fact, instead of becoming more open to diversity, I think in the West, we're closing in. We're actually limiting diversity.
Yeah, I think,
in the name of advancing diversity.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think a lot of people's view of diversity either is code for fewer straight white men, or is code for people who have different skin colors but all think the same thing. right? Ideological homogeneity, essentially, but some type of racial or ethnic diversity on a surface level. And people don't think about the concept very deeply. I think diversity is one of those buzzwords that people like to throw out there. Every single company or organization or institution is going to talk about diversity and maybe even have diversity training and this and this. But it's like, well, what does that really mean? How deep are we going to go in it? And what is a level of diversity that, on what levels does diversity work, and on what levels does it not? On what levels is it a strength? On what levels is it a challenge? And I think if you're being totally honest, you'd recognize that diversity in itself is not, to me, it's a weird target. To me, diversity isn't something that should be a target. It's something that's a natural byproduct of treating people fairly and openly. Human beings are incredibly diverse. As you've alluded to, diversity goes beyond people having different skin colors or ethnic backgrounds. Human beings are inherently diverse. You take a room of 100 people, and there's going to be some degree of diversity in that room, because they're not going to all naturally think the same way or believe the same things. They're going to have different backgrounds in all sorts of ways, different perspectives. And so I think that the word diversity has kind of been hijacked a little to not necessarily mean what it's supposed to. And I think people are also uncomfortable with recognizing that, you know, you often hear someone like Justin Trudeau or some of these politicians or progressive type activists in general, you're saying things like diversity is our strength. And it's like, well, what does that mean?
What does that mean?
Yeah, what does
What's
that mean?
What's it supposed to mean?
Yeah, I don't even know. I don't understand. It's kind of a buzzword, you know, it's a buzz phrase, people say it and people clap. But it's like, well, diversity it also has pros and cons. It's a natural thing, but it has pros and cons. If you have a country, if you have a nation, if you have a culture, there have to be things in common, right? So you can't just, and I say this as someone who grew up in the Middle East, right? And you can recognize that there are certain things that can be incompatible to various degrees, right? So in the UK or in other Western countries, for example, it can be funny because you'll have something like Pride Month or this, you know, celebration of the so-called LGBTQIAAP plus community, 2S, I don't know the whole acronym, the whole thing these days. And then...
Well, it depends where you live, actually.
Okay. How many letters are in the password?
Yeah. There are fewer in England than there are here.
Okay.
As I understand it.
Interesting. Yeah. So you'll have that, and then juxtaposition, you know, you'll have this sort of pro-Muslim or pro-Islam thing. And again, as someone who grew up in Saudi, you're like, well, how compatible are these things here, right? That's so... And sometimes it comes to a head. I mean, that happened in some of the schools, especially in the Midlands in the UK, where you had large groups of Muslim parents threatening to withdraw their children from schools and protesting schools because they didn't like some of the ideas and ideologies that were being, you know, they don't want their children learning about infinite genders and transgenderism and, you know, the LGBT stuff. Like, that's not what they want. And that's an obvious, very obvious incompatibility. But because of the political correctness, it's this landmine issue, right? I mean, one blessing I have is that I'm quite happy to jump on landmines that people are not. Even with that particular issue, like, no, it's very obvious that, okay, those things might not work side by side in the way you magically want them to, and people are just like, okay, like, let's just pretend that they do. And it's like, well, at some point, those different agendas are going to come to some type of head. And I think we recognize, you know, with the concept of multiculturalism, of course you can have people from all types of nationalities and backgrounds, races, ethnicities, and so on in a city, in a country, or whatever, living together. But again, there have to be commonalities. There has to be genuine tolerances. That's another word that gets hijacked, this concept of tolerance, where people like to say it, but how tolerant are some of the people who like to say it? Tolerance, inclusion, diversity, equity, all of these terms, I think we speak about them on a very superficial level, but when you go into them in more detail, you find that it's a little bit more complicated, and there are more trade-offs potentially involved with some of it than I think people realize, let alone feel comfortable discussing.